I figured it was about time to make a video where I shared some of my thoughts on the LA7200 anamorphic adapter. This is an old school anamorphic lens adapter made by Panasonic back in the DVX100 days, and it was initially intended to stretch 4x3 out to 16:9. Because it's a 1.33x anamorphic adapter, you can actually use it on a 16:9 camera, like most common HD cameras are, to stretch it to 2.4, 2.5. It's actually 2.36, I think, is the actual math. But you get that anamorphic look. Now, I bought this initially because I like the way anamorphic looks. I think it looks really cool. I think it looks really filmic, and it definitely has a certain aesthetic that you can't always capture just filming HD and then cropping. So I bought it for around $1,000 at the time. This was maybe 3 years ago. But I don't always use it, and there's a couple reasons for that. Now, I've done some shooting, some test images on my blog. I think I've done 3 of them so far over the past couple of years, so you can check those out if you want. They're on my blog. But I haven't made a video, and this isn't an official review or anything like that. It's just some of my thoughts and some things to take note of if you're considering buying one of these. It's one of the more popular anamorphic adapters, but I don't think it's the best one by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also not the most expensive. They can be found anywhere from like $800 to $1,000 online, usually on eBay. You might be able to find them locally on Craigslist, but they're pretty rare. You don't see too many of them, but they're usually available on eBay, so you can check it out there. Essentially, all you need to do is get the right step up or step down rings, however you want to look at it. I believe it's step up, but I always forget the order. Anyway, you take a lens, like typically a prime lens. This is a 50mm Nikon, manual aperture, manual focus, everything's manual on it, and you just attach it to the LA7200, and it essentially squeezes your image down, and then you unstretch it in post-production. Pretty common if you're familiar with the anamorphic workflow. And while I wouldn't necessarily recommend the 50, it's a little long. I've had more success with like the 24mm lens, especially shooting on a crop sensor like the GH1 or the GH4. That'll give you better results. But the problem ends up becoming is that you can't focus close with this adapter. It's meant for longer distances, which is totally fine if you're filming landscapes or something far away, but as most of you probably know, when you're doing any kind of film, whether it's narrative or documentary, you need to focus close because that's usually where your subject is, whether it's a person, an element in the scene, whatever it is, it's usually closer, and that gives you that shallow depth of field look that most people also associate with being cinematic. That's very hard to do with this adapter as it comes. So one of the things that I did to try and fix that problem, people had talked about diopters. And a diopter is essentially a close-up filter. It allows for the lens to focus closer, but it's another piece of glass. So I found these also on eBay, and it's attached to a step-up ring right now, but it's essentially a piece of glass. It's a +1 diopter or close-up filter or macro filter. There's a lot of different names for them, but usually close-up filter is kind of how you'll find them. And I found mine, it's like a pack of 4 for like 20 bucks. So they're not expensive, but they're also not really high-end glass either. But what I did was I took this close-up filter, and you need to put it in front of the anamorphic. And there's really no way to attach anything to the front of the LA7200. There's no filter threads or anything. You just have this slight kind of matte box essentially. But what you can do is get an 86 to 105mm step-up ring. It's kind of an uncommon step-up ring. Some people have had trouble finding it. It might be because they're searching for step-down, because I may have actually written that in a blog. I apologize. But step up, step down, whatever it is, 86 to 105. It doesn't really matter the direction it goes as long as you have 105. That's the key, 105mm. That's what fits in here. And it doesn't actually fit, but with a little work, you can wedge it. You can wedge it in there. And so you have that close-up filter now in front of the anamorphic, and that will actually let you focus closer. I have some example images of that on the blog, and it does help. It does help. But now you've got the anamorphic adapter, the close-up filter, plus the lens. So if you want to change any of this in the setup, it takes time. And that's ultimately the problem with this setup. It's not time efficient. If you want to change the lens, you've got to take this all apart, reset it all up, make sure that your close-up filter is the one you want. There are some lighter close-up filters, like, there's a 0.4 diopter that's available that's a little bit more expensive. There's some higher strength ones like a +2, +5, +10. I've never really used those because I haven't found a need to focus that close. So stick with the +1 probably for the most part. But if you want to change the lens, you got to change that out, and then you're worried about this, front piece falling out because it's not exactly the most professional setup. It's just wedged in there. Like this could, if you bumped it, it could pop out fairly easily. It's probably not going to because it is wedged in there pretty tight. Like it's not really going anywhere as long as you're careful. But it could fall out, And the biggest problem is that the anamorphic adapter itself isn't all that sharp. You're getting, so with anamorphic, you're getting a wider field of view, right? And you're stretching and compressing all this information down. So theoretically, you should have more resolution. But because you've put so much glass and optics in front of the lens, you're decreasing that sharpness or that resolution. And so I've shot stuff with the LA7200 that I was not happy with. It almost looked like it was out of focus, but it wasn't. And there are some ways to work around that, but you have to be very particular with your setup. You can only be, you can only work within this distance to this distance away from the camera for this particular lens, and you end up in a situation where you have all these limitations. And what I don't like is being on a set and having limitations. I want to be able to shoot what I want to shoot the way I want to shoot it. I don't want to have these technical limitations of a piece of equipment saying like, you can't do this, you can't focus there, you can't get that person in frame because it just doesn't work with this particular setup. And so I found that I've actually been happier with the results of not using the anamorphic adapter. Now, you do lose a little bit of that optical quality of having a wider field of view, but still having the same height field of view, because that's what the anamorphic is doing. It's not changing the height at all, it's changing the width of the image. So you do introduce an optical characteristic into the scene that you're filming when you're using anamorphic, because the field of view is a little bit different. But since the LA7200 is only a 1.33x anamorphic, it's not as strong of an effect as like a 1.5 or a 2x anamorphic that's stretching it twice as much. So the anamorphic effect of the LA7200 is not as pronounced as you might hope for. There is some flaring, there is some streaking, that kind of stuff, but your bokeh is still fairly round. It's not extremely oval like it is if you're using a 2x anamorphic. So you just have to keep all that stuff in mind, because it's good, but it's not great and it's not for everyone. I certainly wouldn't use it on anything where I didn't have time to get the shot set up. You need the added luxury of time to use this properly. Otherwise, you'll be rushing and find yourself, all right, just leave that lens on there, just leave it the way it is. We'll just work around it and we'll film that way. And ultimately, that can end up hurting your project because you're not able to capture it the way you want to because you're having to work around the technical limitations. So hence why I don't always use this LA7200. I use it every once in a while for fun projects where I'm like, I feel like doing this anamorphic or whatever, but most of the time I'm sticking with traditional lenses. And it's a shame because anamorphic is a really cool look, and it's unfortunate that more lenses, true anamorphic lenses, aren't available. There are some other newer anamorphic adapters, like SLR Magic makes one that I haven't tried out personally, but I hope to one day, and that's supposed to be a little bit better. But the LA7200, I don't know that I could strongly recommend it. I think it's definitely a fun thing to play with. It's a fun novelty, but not essential. If you're looking for anamorphic, you probably want to look somewhere else. But maybe you're willing to work around those limitations. Maybe it doesn't matter to you. Certainly at least test one out yourself and see how you like it. But for me, it's not the holy grail of anamorphic. For $1,000, it probably isn't worth the investment. Hopefully that helps anyone who is looking to get one of these. Definitely if you're going to get it, though, you have to do the diopter, the close-up filter trick, because without that, you are very limited in what you can film, and you have to seriously work around that. So you definitely need the diopters.